Hey guys, tonight we begin with something cozy, or maybe not so cozy, depending on your perspective. I invite you to dim the lights, pull up your blanket, and imagine yourself transported back to a time when the height of architectural luxury was a wooden hut. Yes, tonight we're drifting into the world of medieval sleep, where winters were brutal, roofs leaked, and insulation was basically hope you don't die before sunrise. Relax, because the people we're talking about didn't have that luxury. But you do. Lucky you. So let's glide into the Middle Ages, when survival was already a full-time job, and sleeping through the night wasn't exactly guaranteed. We'll look at how ordinary people, peasants, serfs, and the occasional unlucky villager, got through freezing nights inside drafty huts. And as usual, we'll be stopping for some ironic observations because, honestly, how else do you talk about someone trying to nap next to a pig for warmth without chuckling a little? First, picture the hut itself. Forget any romantic fantasy of rustic log cabins with neatly cut beams. A medieval wooden hut was usually small, dark, and smoky. The walls might be rough planks if you were lucky, or wattle and daub, a polite term for sticks smeared with mud and straw if you weren't. The roof was thatch. Thatch looks cute in storybooks, but in reality it leaks, it harbors bugs, and occasionally it just collapses under snow. So imagine lying down for the night, staring up, and wondering whether a mouse family was preparing for a midnight marathon, right above your head. Sleep tight. Inside there was one room, just one. Maybe two if your landlord was feeling generous. This meant that cooking, eating, working, and sleeping all happened in the same smoky box. A central hearth gave light and warmth, but without a chimney. The smoke simply filled the hut, drifting upwards until it seeped out through the roof. That meant your nightly bedtime routine often included coughing yourself to sleep, which isn't exactly ideal for restfulness. On the other hand, it probably helped lull you into unconsciousness faster. Silver linings. Now the real question, where did people actually sleep? Well, beds in the sense we think of them, frames with mattresses, were rare luxuries. If you were a wealthy peasant, you might have had a wooden frame with a straw mattress. And mattress here means a sack stuffed with straw, reeds, or sometimes feathers, if you were living the dream. Over time, the straw got moldy. It attracted insects, and yes, it stank. But when it was 10 degrees outside, and your only alternative was the hard floor, you wouldn't complain. Most huts didn't have the space for individual beds anyway. Families often slept together in one large bed, or in heaps on the floor with blankets made of wool or animal skins. Privacy? Forget it. If you were a child, you grew up knowing every sound your parents made at night. If you were an adult, you were constantly aware of the person next to you breathing too loudly. It wasn't exactly a romantic setup. And since huts were small, sometimes you didn't just share with family members, you shared with animals. Chickens in a basket at your feet, maybe a goat tied near the hearth. And if you were really desperate for warmth, you might bring in the pig. Yes, literally sleeping with pigs wasn't just an insult. It was sometimes a survival strategy. Let's pause on that image. You, lying under a scratchy wool blanket, your brother snoring in your ear, smoke stinging your eyes, while a pig grunts softly at your feet. And outside, the wind is howling across a snowy field. Cozy, right? Well, in its own way, yes. Because in the medieval world, the standard for comfort was very, very low. And speaking of blankets, what did people actually use to cover themselves? Wool was the most common, though it was itchy and heavy. If you had a sheepskin or deerskin, that added warmth. Linen sheets were technically known, but they were expensive, so peasants usually just piled whatever fabric they could scrounge. In especially harsh conditions, people layered up in their daytime clothing and simply collapsed under a pile of cloaks. In fact, one medieval monk wrote that in his community, men would often sleep fully dressed, boots and all, because removing them meant risking frostbite. And that's in a monastery. Imagine what the peasants were doing. Now, we can't talk about medieval sleep without mentioning the curious phenomenon of first sleep and second sleep. People in these huts often went to bed not in one long stretch, but in two phases. You'd lie down after dusk, sleep for a few hours, then wake up in the middle of the night. Maybe you'd tend the fire, check on the animals, or, if you were religious, say some prayers. Then, after an hour or two, you'd drift back into your second sleep until dawn. This wasn't insomnia, it was just normal. In fact, the middle of the night wakefulness was sometimes the only quiet moment in a hut, crammed with family, children, and livestock. Ironically, those dark, freezing hours may have been the most peaceful part of a peasant's life. Now let's think about heating, because no matter how many skins and blankets you piled on, the real battle was against the cold. A central fire in the hearth helped, but wood was expensive. Peasants weren't exactly chopping down forests at will. That land usually belonged to the lord, so fires were kept small, often just embers glowing through the night. This meant the hut was cold, really cold. We're talking frost forming on the inside of the walls, your breath visible in the air. One medieval chronicler even noted that in particularly harsh winters, ink froze in the inkwells and ale froze in the mugs. So if your hut was managing to stay even a little warmer than the outside, you were already winning. And remember, windows, if they existed at all, were just small holes covered with oiled cloth or thin wood shutters. So there was no insulation. Every gust of wind seemed to sneak in and find its way under your blanket. It's not hard to imagine people huddled together like penguins, shifting closer through the night. The phrase body heat wasn't just romantic, it was essential. Children slept between parents not for affection, but because they were literally the family's portable heating devices. Another fun fact, medieval huts often had floors made of beaten earth. That meant that in winter, you were essentially sleeping on top of frozen ground. Some people scattered rushes or straw to create a barrier, but those needed regular replacing, or they turned into filthy, damp mats of bacteria. Of course, no one in the Middle Ages really understood germs, so they just lived with it. The smell, let's not dwell on it. Just imagine lying there inhaling smoke, animal odors, and the faint whiff of last week's rushes, and then trying to drift into dreams. It's worth noting that while peasants slept like this, wealthier people weren't always that much better off. Sure, nobles had stone halls with bigger fireplaces, and their beds might have been draped with hangings to keep out drafts. But medieval castles were notorious for being cold, echoing, and impossible to heat. One French chronicler wrote that you could never sit by a fire without your back freezing, because the stone walls radiated cold like ice. So yes, the peasants had huts, but the nobility had ice palaces. At least the peasants had pigs. Now what about bedtime routines? Did people do anything special before sleep? Well, yes. Peasants often ended the day with prayers, sometimes murmured as a family before the hearth. But beyond that, bedtime was dictated by the sun. Once it was dark, candles and rushlights were expensive, so people simply went to bed. Staying up late was a luxury for monasteries or nobles. And for peasants, there wasn't really a concept of me-time at night. The hut was too crowded, the day had been too long, and there were animals to care for. Sleep was less of a restful escape, and more of a pause in survival. Still, there was some comfort to be found. Family closeness wasn't optional, but it did mean you were never truly alone. The warmth of human and animal bodies, the rhythm of shared breathing, and the glow of embers gave the hut a kind of rough intimacy. Imagine lying there, hearing the wind outside, but also hearing the soft snorts of pigs and the murmurs of family. That in its own way was security. And let's not forget dreams. People in the Middle Ages believed dreams carried meaning, sometimes divine, sometimes ominous. Waking up in the middle of the night after your first sleep, you might discuss a strange dream with whoever else was awake. And if you couldn't sleep again, maybe you'd tell stories or sing low songs. Oral tradition was strong, and these midnight hours probably helped keep folklore alive. So in a way, sleeplessness wasn't wasted. It was culture. So to sum up the nightly experience of a medieval villager, a smoky, crowded hut, a straw mattress crawling with insects, a blanket that scratched, frost on the walls, livestock at your feet, and a constant low-level fear that tomorrow you might not wake up at all. And yet people did wake up. They survived. They endured winters in huts that modern people would find unlivable, and they did it for centuries, which is both depressing and weirdly impressive. Let's float from here into the next part of this story, where we'll look at how entire communities adapted their sleeping habits to the seasons, why summer nights were sometimes just as uncomfortable, and how different regions in Europe came up with their own ways of coping. Because the medieval winter bed was only half the story. All right, let's stretch out a little and float into another corner of this medieval night. Because sleeping in winter huts wasn't just a personal battle with the cold. It was also a seasonal, communal, and cultural ritual. What you did in January was not the same as what you did in July. And honestly, if you thought summer meant a break from discomfort, well, not really. Medieval life always found a way to keep things awkward. So let's start with the obvious, summer nights. You might think that without frost, without snow, and without the need to invite your pig into bed, things would be a little easier. But no. Summer meant mosquitoes, fleas, and the charming smell of heat mixing with whatever was fermenting inside the hut. Remember, these houses didn't exactly have air circulation systems. Opening the shutters at night might let in a breeze, but it also let in bugs and the occasional curious animal. So people often just endured, lying on their straw mattresses in stifling heat, sweating in the dark, and wondering if this was better or worse than shivering. This is also where we start seeing some regional differences. In Northern Europe, the huts stayed cold, damp, and smoky, even in summer. In Southern Europe, like Italy or Spain, houses were sometimes built with stone walls that at least kept a bit of coolness at night. But let's not over-romanticize it. Stone walls also meant they retained heat from the day. So imagine trying to sleep inside what felt like a low-budget pizza oven. Fun. Now, communities adapted their sleeping schedules not just to the seasons, but also to the agricultural calendar. During summer, people went to bed even later, sometimes not until after a long evening of work in the fields. In winter, it was the opposite. Dark by 5 o'clock, asleep shortly after and awake again in the middle of the night, staring into the smoky rafters. You might even hear your neighbors awake at the same time, since huts weren't exactly soundproof. Medieval villages were basically one giant ASMR track of coughs, snores, and creaking wood. And speaking of sound, let's talk about noise pollution, medieval edition. People often imagine the past as quiet, but inside a one-room hut it was the opposite. Children cried, dogs barked, chickens clucked in their baskets, and cows groaned outside. And if you lived near a church, the bells could ring at odd hours, especially for monks' nighttime prayers. It's almost comforting to realize insomnia was not invented by smartphones. Medieval villagers had plenty of reasons to stare into the dark and sigh. Let's circle back to that curious two-sleep system. We know from diaries, court records, and even medical texts that this wasn't a rare quirk. Everyone did it. The first sleep would usually last 3 to 4 hours. Then you'd wake, maybe poke at the embers to keep them alive, maybe roll over and whisper a prayer or two. For couples, this wakeful period was considered a good time for, you guessed it, marital activity. Because nothing says romance like coughing in the smoke, while your mother-in-law is 2 feet away on the straw bed. But it was practical. With work during daylight and constant cold, the middle of the night was the only private-ish window. Of course, thy second sleep would carry you into the morning, though it was rarely restful. Remember that animals didn't exactly respect human sleep schedules. If a pig decided to root around at midnight, or a rooster misjudged dawn and crowed too early, your slumber was basically over. Add in the occasional rat rustling through the rushes, and you've got yourself a nightly medieval adventure. Now we should probably talk about beds in more detail. The bed, such as it was, carried enormous symbolic weight in medieval culture. For nobles, a bed was a prized possession, draped in curtains and hangings to keep out drafts. But for peasants, the family bed was more than furniture. It was survival equipment. A good straw mattress could last a few months before turning into an ecosystem of mold and bugs. Families often refurbished them seasonally, stuffing in new straw after harvest. This was called a bed straw change, and yes, it was considered an event. Imagine marking the calendar. Replace bug-infested bedding with slightly less bug-infested bedding. Luxury. Children usually piled in together, sometimes in makeshift cradles or just bundled in cloaks on the floor. Parents took the warmer spots, closer to the hearth if possible. Grandparents, if they were still around, got a corner. The hierarchy of warmth was not subtle. And if there wasn't enough room, well, tough luck. The weaker members of the family often endured the coldest places, and survival was not guaranteed. It's grim, but it also shows how strategic bedtime was. Where you slept literally mattered for life or death. Let's not forget the role of community events. In especially harsh winters, neighbors sometimes huddled together in one hut for warmth. Think of it as a medieval sleepover, minus the snacks and plus the lice. And yes, lice were everywhere. Combs existed, but they were crude. Delusing was part of daily life, and beds were the main battleground. If you woke up itching, congratulations, you were normal. One of the more peculiar aspects of medieval sleep culture was how religious belief shaped it. The night was considered spiritually dangerous. Darkness was linked to sin, temptation, and demons. That's one reason prayers before bed were so heavily emphasized. People genuinely feared that while they slept, their souls might be vulnerable. Which, of course, didn't help with relaxation. Imagine trying to drift off while being told you might be spiritually attacked in your dreams. No wonder insomnia thrived. This fear also tied into architecture. Some huts were built with protective charms hidden in the walls. Small crosses, herbs, or even animal bones meant to ward off evil. So while you were coughing in the smoke and scratching at fleas, at least you could rest easy, knowing your neighbor had shoved a chicken foot in the rafters for protection. Medieval problem-solving at its finest. And while we're here, let's talk about the physical posture of sleep. You probably imagine people lying flat, but often they didn't. Propped-up sleeping was common, especially because lying flat in smoky huts made breathing harder. Beds sometimes had angled boards or stuffed bolsters to keep people half-sitting. It wasn't comfortable, but it was better than choking all night. Plus, there was a cultural belief that lying too flat resembled death, and that inviting death was, well, unwise. So if you picture a medieval peasant asleep, think less peaceful nap, and more exhausted person awkwardly slumped like a sack of turnips. Now let's add another layer. Illness. Cold, damp huts were breeding grounds for respiratory problems. Coughs, fevers, and chills were constant companions. And since sleep was communal, one sick person meant everyone got sick. Imagine winter nights filled with hacking coughs echoing around the room. Not exactly the lullaby you'd hope for. And yet, this was just normal life. Complaints about sleeplessness were so common that medieval doctors offered advice, usually along the lines of try wine and herbs, which honestly still sounds like decent advice. And here's a final image to leave part 2 with. Picture a midwinter night, a family huddled in their hut. The father stirs the fire, trying not to use too much wood. The mother shifts under a rough wool blanket, pulling the youngest child closer for warmth. The older children toss on the straw, itchy and uncomfortable. A pig snores near the hearth. Outside, the snow piles against the door. Inside, smoke curls toward the roof, hanging heavy in the air. Everyone is cold, tired, and half suffocated, but they will drift into another restless sleep anyway. Because tomorrow they have to wake up and do it all over again. And that was the reality of medieval sleep. Endurance, improvisation, and a lot of wishing the hut had fewer holes. Next, let's drift onward to how sleep looked in monasteries and castles. Because if you think the peasants had it bad, just wait until we explore the glamorous but equally uncomfortable lives of monks and nobles. Now that we've tucked the peasants into their smoky straw nests, let's float up the social ladder a little. Because if you thought nobility and monks were sleeping like royalty, literally, you might want to temper those expectations. Yes, they had better blankets, and yes, they had fancier words for their furniture. But at the end of the day, they were still freezing, still coughing in smoke, and still living in drafty stone boxes that made huts look almost cozy by comparison. Let's start with monasteries. Monks, in theory, had simple, disciplined sleep schedules. In reality, they had some of the worst sleep habits in medieval Europe. Picture this. It's the middle of the night, maybe 2 or 3 in the morning, and just as you're sinking into that rare moment of warm slumber, a bell clangs. Time for matins, the first service of the day. Up you go, trudging in the dark, robes dragging, breath visible in the cold air. Sleep for monks was not a continuous luxury. It was chopped into strange little blocks dictated by prayer. You didn't sleep until you were rested. You slept until the bell told you to stop. Monks usually slept in dormitories, long halls lined with beds or pallets. Privacy, none. Comfort, minimal. Bedding was often simple straw sacks, sometimes with a woolen blanket if the monastery was decently funded. In stricter orders, like the Cistercians, monks were expected to sleep in their habits, that is, fully dressed in their robes. The reasoning was partly practical, fewer excuses to linger in bed, but also spiritual. The idea was that even in sleep, you should be ready for devotion, or more cynically, it was just another way to remind you that comfort was a sin. The temperature in those stone dormitories, miserable. Monasteries were often deliberately austere. Heating was minimal, sometimes entirely absent. Fires were seen as indulgent, so monks just huddled together and dealt with it. Some historians even note frost forming on the walls inside monasteries. Imagine waking up at 2 a.m., shuffling through a freezing corridor in bare feet, and trying to chant in monotone Latin while your nose is dripping. Holy, yes. Restful, no. And yet there's a strange comfort here. For monks, the cold, the deprivation, the broken sleep, it was all part of their spiritual practice. They weren't aiming for comfort. They were aiming for endurance. In a way, monks turned insomnia into holiness. The rest of us just call it misery. Now let's glide over to the nobility. You'd think lords and ladies, sitting at the top of the feudal pyramid, had perfected the art of luxury sleep. And sure, their beds were bigger, their blankets richer, and their walls slightly less muddy. But castles were not cozy. Castles were giant refrigerators made of stone. In summer, they trapped heat like ovens. In winter, they radiated cold so thoroughly that no fireplace could fight it. One French noble famously complained that you could roast your front by the fire and still have your back frozen solid. That's not exactly a glowing TripAdvisor review. Beds themselves were works of art. Noble beds had heavy wooden frames, carved posts, and most importantly, curtains. Those bed curtains weren't just for privacy. They were insulation. When you drew the curtains, you trapped your body heat inside, creating a tiny microclimate. Without them, sleeping in a castle would have been like camping in a cave. So while peasants piled into one bed with the pig, nobles basically built tents around their mattresses. Same idea, fancier execution. The mattresses themselves were stuffed with feathers if you were lucky, but even feather beds sagged, grew lumpy and attracted mites. Sheets were linen, often changed seasonally, which is a polite way of saying once in a while when they started to stink too much. Blankets might be wool, fur, or both. Wealthier nobles layered themselves with ermine, squirrel, or even bear fur. That sounds decadent, but let's be honest, it was still just trying to keep the cold out. A mink-lined blanket doesn't change the fact that your castle window is basically a hole in the wall. Noble families often slept together too, though in a different way. A lord and lady had their own bed, but servants sometimes slept nearby, either on benches or in the same room. Privacy was rare even for the elite, and when guests visited, it wasn't unusual to share beds. Not for romance, just for practicality. Travel was exhausting. Inns were scarce, and sharing a bed was considered normal. In fact, many historical figures left behind charming anecdotes about waking up beside someone unexpected. Apparently, it was a great way to bond, though I suspect more than a few awkward mornings occurred, and castles, let's remember, were noisy. Guards tromped through the halls. Dogs barked in the courtyards. The wind howled through every crack in the stonework. Servants clattered about at odd hours, and if you were unlucky enough to live near a moat, you might even hear frogs croaking all night. So while nobles had more layers of fabric between them and the cold, they still weren't drifting into serene 8-hour slumbers. At best, they were getting interrupted snoozes behind velvet curtains. Let's also mention sickness again, because castles weren't immune. Cold, damp air made respiratory problems just as common for nobles as for peasants. And with fewer people per room but bigger, colder spaces, illness lingered. Nobles did have the advantage of medical care, if you count being bled by a barber surgeon as care, but it didn't make their nights much easier. A noblewoman with a fever still lay sweating under heavy blankets, in a room where the walls dripped condensation, and probably wondered if she wouldn't have been warmer in a peasant's hut with the pig. So we end up with an ironic balance. Peasants had crowded smoky huts, where survival meant huddling in heaps. Nobles had cavernous stone fortresses, where survival meant retreating into fabric cocoons. Neither side had what we'd call comfort. They just had different flavors of discomfort. One was itchy and smoky, the other drafty and echoing. It's like comparing two bad hotels. Neither one gets 5 stars. Before we drift away from nobility, let's pause on one peculiar thing: the symbolism of the bed. For nobles, the bed wasn't just furniture, it was political theater. Royal beds in particular were almost public objects. Monarchs received visitors in bed, made decisions in bed, and even staged rituals around their sleep. The royal bed was a symbol of fertility, authority, and power, and yet at the same time, it was still just a place to shiver through another damp night. That irony is peak medieval life. So whether you were chanting monks in an icy dormitory, or nobles curling up behind velvet curtains in a freezing castle, medieval winter sleep was a shared experience of discomfort. Different surroundings, same result. Restless nights, frequent interruptions, and waking up groggy to face another cold day. Next, let's drift toward the medical and cultural side of things. Because medieval doctors had opinions about how people should sleep, most of them bizarre, impractical, and often hilarious in hindsight. We'll also peek at the folklore of night terrors, demons, and dreams, which shaped how people thought about bedtime itself. So far, we've looked at the practical side of medieval sleep, where people lay down, how they tried not to freeze, and which unlucky animal they dragged inside for warmth. But the Middle Ages weren't just about surviving the night. They were also about interpreting it. Doctors, priests, and ordinary villagers had plenty of opinions on how you should sleep, what your dreams meant, and who or what might be visiting you in the dark. And because this is the Middle Ages, most of those opinions were, A little strange. Let's start with the medical side. Medieval physicians inherited a lot of ideas from the ancient world, especially from Galen and Aristotle. According to humoral theory, your sleep was directly tied to the balance of the four humors in your body: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Too much food before bed? That would generate excess phlegm and disturb your sleep. Too little food? That might upset the balance of your blood. Basically, no matter what happened, they could blame it on a humor. Insomnia must be your bile. Nightmares? Clearly the fault of phlegm. Sleepwalking. Don't worry, that's just heat rising from your stomach to your brain. Makes perfect sense, right? Doctors gave advice accordingly. They suggested not eating too much before bed, though for peasants that was rarely an option anyway. They recommended certain herbs like poppy or valerian to encourage sleep, and they even had preferred sleeping positions. The ideal way to sleep, according to medical texts, was on your right side, then turning to your left midway through the night. Lying on your stomach was discouraged, since it was thought to encourage sinful thoughts, and lying flat on your back, that was dangerous because demons could sit on your chest. Which brings us neatly to folklore. Medieval people genuinely believed the night was haunted territory. When the sun went down, the safe, ordered world gave way to uncertainty. Spirits, witches, demons, all of them were said to be more active in the dark. If you suffered from sleep paralysis, that terrifying sensation of waking but being unable to move, the explanation wasn't neurological. It was demonic. People called it the nightmare, literally a malicious spirit pressing down on you while you slept. Later folklore would picture it as a witch or goblin squatting on your chest. But in the Middle Ages, it was simply accepted as one of the risks of going to bed. Sweet dreams. Nightmares weren't just personal problems. They could be signs. Dreams in general were thought to have meaning, sometimes divine, sometimes prophetic. If you dreamed of fire, it might mean conflict ahead. If you dreamed of animals, interpretations varied depending on whether they were tame or wild. Priests often warned against putting too much faith in dreams, but people did anyway. After all, if your nights are long, cold, and miserable, at least your dreams might offer a little entertainment or a warning about which neighbor to avoid. The church had a complicated relationship with sleep. On one hand, sleep was natural and necessary. On the other hand, too much sleep was considered sinful. Sloth, after all, was one of the 7 deadly sins. Monks were constantly warned against oversleeping, which is a little ironic, given that their schedules were deliberately designed to deprive them of rest. Ordinary villagers were also reminded that sleep was fine, but not if it distracted from prayer or work. In other words, you were allowed to collapse from exhaustion, but not to enjoy it. Folklore also warned against sleeping in certain ways. Sleeping with your head facing north was unlucky. Leaving a candle burning could invite spirits. And some people believed that if you slept with your mouth open, your soul could escape, or worse, something else could creep in. Imagine tucking yourself into a smoky straw bed, shivering under a wool blanket. If there's one thing that defined medieval sleep, it was the rhythm of the seasons. Unlike us with our clocks and electric lights, people in the Middle Ages were ruled almost entirely by the rising and setting of the sun. And nowhere did this matter more than in the long, punishing winters. In northern Europe, winter nights stretched on for what felt like forever. Imagine sitting in your dark wooden hut, the daylight gone by mid-afternoon, and knowing you wouldn't see the sun again until late morning. That's over 14 hours of darkness, sometimes closer to 16. For peasants with little fuel and no candles to spare, it was simply impossible to stay awake for all of that. So sleep became broken into segments. Historians call this segmented sleep, or the first and second sleep. People would go to bed not long after sundown, sleep for 4 or 5 hours, wake in the middle of the night, and then return to bed until dawn. That waking period was often quiet, but it wasn't wasted. Families might stir the fire, pray, talk softly, or even make a trip outside to the latrine if they dared brave the cold. Some used the time for reflection, others for intimacy. In a way, midnight was its own little world, a secret interval between the day and the next day. Winter made this pattern even more pronounced. The colder and darker the night, the more you leaned into broken sleep. Villagers might huddle together, doze for a while, then wake up shivering, feed the animals, or add wood to the fire before lying back down. Children sometimes played quietly in that middle-of-the-night window. Adults sometimes worried. The darkness, after all, was a place of both mystery and fear. But it was also a kind of communal experience. Everyone in the village knew that they too were awake in those same hours, listening to the wind groan against the hut walls. By contrast, summer flipped the rhythm entirely. When the sun rose before 5 and set after 9, nights were short and precious. Farmers couldn't afford long rest. They rose with the light to take advantage of every working hour. That meant cutting their sleep shorter, sometimes only 6 hours or less. Winter made you drowsy, summer made you weary, and spring and autumn were the only times you got something close to balance. Daylight wasn't the only seasonal factor. Festivals, church calendars, and agricultural demands all shaped when you could rest. During harvest season, peasants might work from dawn until after dark, collapsing into sleep as soon as they could, sometimes even in the fields. During long church vigils or feast days, sleep was deliberately cut short so people could pray. Life was dictated not by what your body wanted, but by what the season demanded. This created a strange paradox. Medieval winters should have meant more sleep, but they often resulted in less quality sleep. Long hours in bed were broken, restless, and cold. You woke up with stiff joints, smoky lungs, and the lingering sense that the night was too long to ever feel restful. And in summer you hardly had time to recover. Sleep, for medieval people, was never truly refreshing. It was just a way to get by until the next day's work began. So while we complain today about tossing and turning, medieval villagers would probably have laughed at the idea of sleep hygiene. For them, sleep wasn't something to optimize. It was something you survived, just another battle against the seasons, the dark and the bitter cold pressing through the wooden walls. So, let's talk about one of the most awkward parts of medieval sleeping arrangements, the fact that you almost never slept alone. Privacy wasn't really a thing in most households, unless you happened to be a lord or a wealthy merchant with multiple rooms. For the majority of people, the bed was a shared, crowded space, partly out of necessity, partly out of custom, and partly because medieval people just had very different ideas about personal boundaries. Picture a peasant hut in winter. There's a single main room where everyone eats, works, and, yes, sleeps. At night, the straw mattress or pile of rushes on the floor became a kind of family nest. Parents, children, maybe even grandparents all piled in together, trying to conserve what little warmth the fire hadn't provided. It was less about comfort and more about survival. The body heat of 5 or 6 people made the difference between shivering all night and at least being somewhat warm. Imagine your toddler kicking you in the ribs while your grandfather snores next to your head. That was life. Even among wealthier families, sharing beds was normal. Large curtained beds might accommodate multiple siblings, servants, or even guests. Hospitality in the Middle Ages often meant offering a spot in your bed, yes, your actual bed, because that was simply practical. Inns, when they existed, were crowded, and it wasn't unusual for complete strangers to share a mattress. A weary traveler might tuck in beside someone he'd never met before, both of them pretending this was totally normal. And in that context it was. The social rules around this were fascinating. Sharing a bed didn't necessarily imply intimacy in the way we might assume today. It was just a way of making do. Peasants, travelers, monks, and even political figures ended up as bedfellows. In fact, in royal and noble circles, bed-sharing could even be a tool of diplomacy. Ambassadors or noble guests sometimes slept in the same bed as their hosts, not for warmth, but as a gesture of trust and camaraderie. Nothing said. We're allies now, quite like awkwardly rolling over to avoid breathing in each other's faces all night. Children especially were accustomed to bed sharing. Siblings piled together not just as a necessity, but as habit. Accounts from later centuries describe kids remembering fondly, or not so fondly, the warmth of being sandwiched between brothers and sisters under a single wool blanket. It was noisy, crowded, and hardly restful, but it was also considered perfectly ordinary. Of course, this arrangement brought its own challenges. Privacy was basically non-existent. Marital intimacy. Let's just say it happened with the kids still in the room, because where else would you go? Hygiene was also a problem. If one person had lice, everyone got lice. If one person had fleas, well, welcome to the club. And if one person had the unfortunate habit of rolling around in their sleep, good luck to whoever was lying next to them. It also shaped how people thought about sleep as a social act. Today we think of sleep as deeply personal. Your bed, your pillow, your little nest of comfort. In the Middle Ages, sleep was communal. It reinforced family bonds, village ties, and sometimes even political ones. To go to bed was to enter into a shared state of vulnerability, surrounded by others who were just as cold, tired, and human as you. So while the idea of bed sharing with strangers might horrify us today, for medieval people, it was as unremarkable as sharing a table at dinner. It was just part of life in a world where space, warmth, and resources were limited. Sleep wasn't about luxury. It was about getting through the night together. Now, if you've ever dozed off in front of a fireplace, you'll know it's one of the coziest feelings in the world. A soft glow, the gentle crackle of burning logs, a little warmth seeping into the room. Medieval people had that too, sort of. The problem was, their fires were as much a danger as they were a comfort. Sleeping with fire in a wooden hut wasn't exactly the safest idea. But then again, what other choice did they have? In most peasant houses, the hearth was smack in the middle of the main room. There was no chimney, not even a proper vent in many cases. The smoke just sort of drifted upward, filling the space until it slowly seeped out through a hole in the roof or the gaps between the planks. That meant if you were sleeping on the floor or near the fire, you were also breathing in smoke all night. Imagine the sensation of waking up coughing, eyes stinging, throat raw every single winter morning. Basically, medieval people invented second-hand smoke centuries before cigarettes. But of course, they couldn't just let the fire go out. Keeping the embers alive was a matter of survival. A dead fire meant an icy hut, stiff blankets, and a miserable scramble to relight it in the cold dark. So families tended their hearth carefully. Someone, often the mother or whichever child was unlucky that week, would wake up in the middle of the night to stir the coals, add fresh wood, and keep the flame going. Forget to do it and everyone froze. Do it wrong and, well, you might wake up to your thatched roof catching fire. This was the constant danger. Warmth and destruction lived side by side. Wooden huts with straw roofs weren't exactly flame-resistant. A single spark leaping out of the hearth could reduce the whole place to ashes. And because houses were close together, one blaze could wipe out a village before anyone had time to react. So people slept with this low-level awareness that their warm, cozy fire might also be their doom. Comfort and catastrophe all in the same glow. For wealthier families, fireplaces with chimneys helped a little. Stone walls and brick hearths contained the risk better than open flames in wooden huts. But even noble households weren't immune. Chimneys clogged, sparks flew, and buildings still burned down with alarming regularity. In fact, Fires were so common in medieval towns that some places had ordinances about when you could and couldn't light them. Night curfews for fire use weren't about bedtime etiquette. They were about preventing yet another inferno from wiping out half the city. The smoke problem added another layer. People essentially marinated themselves in wood smoke all winter long. It clung to clothes, hair, and bedding. For peasants sleeping directly on rushes or straw near the fire, the combination of damp, mildew, and smoke meant that your bed always smelled like a campfire gone wrong. Some people probably built up a tolerance. Others likely developed respiratory problems we'd recognize today as chronic illness. But for them, it was just part of life. You coughed, you sniffled, and you went about your day. Despite the risk, though, fires were essential. They provided not just warmth, but light in the endless winter darkness. Families would sit around the hearth before bed, telling stories, repairing tools, or spinning wool. Then, when it was time to sleep, they'd nestle down as close as possible to the embers, knowing they'd have to wake and tend it again in a few hours. It was a cycle of vigilance and fatigue. Sleep wasn't peaceful. It was punctuated by the responsibilities of keeping the hut, and everyone in it, alive. So the medieval bed was always in negotiation with fire. Too far away and you froze. Too close and you risked going up in flames. A nightly gamble, played out in every smoky room across Europe. Dreams have always been one of those strange, slippery things, part natural, part mysterious, and for medieval people very often part supernatural. Today we think of dreams as the random product of the brain, sorting out memories and emotions. Back then, though, dreams were something closer to a message system, a kind of nightly post office that might deliver letters from God, whispers from the devil, or, if you were unlucky, just a reminder that you ate too much cabbage stew before bed. Let's set the scene. You've made it through another freezing evening in your wooden hut. The fire is down to glowing embers. Your family is snoring in a tangled heap around you. You're half buried under a scratchy wool blanket that smells faintly of smoke and livestock. Finally, you drift off into that restless, segmented sleep we talked about earlier. And then the visions begin. In the medieval imagination, dreams weren't just personal quirks. They were meaningful, sometimes dangerously so. Clerics wrote entire treatises on how to interpret them. Were they from God, trying to send you guidance? Or from demons attempting to lead you astray? Or were they simply the result of your humors, the bodily fluids that, according to medieval medicine, dictated your personality and health, being out of balance? If you had a particularly vivid dream after eating onions, well, maybe that was just phlegm misbehaving. Nightmares especially carried weight. People believed they could be literal attacks by demons. In fact, the word nightmare itself comes from the old belief in a mara, a wicked spirit or goblin that pressed down on your chest while you slept, suffocating you with fear. Sleep paralysis, in other words, wasn't explained with neurology back then. It was explained with the idea that an evil presence was sitting on you, trying to steal your soul or at least ruin your night. Not the most relaxing thought when you're already huddled in a creaky hut that groans with every gust of wind. Dreams also bled into everyday decisions. Kings and nobles sometimes claimed that a dream had guided their choices. If a monarch dreamt of victory, it could be spun as divine approval for a war. If a peasant dreamt of famine, it might be seen as a warning to store up grain. People kept these dream memories alive in stories, in sermons, even in law courts. To dream was to receive a message worth at least considering. Of course, most people's nightly visions were probably more mundane. After all, if you spend your entire day threshing grain or chasing goats, what else is your subconscious going to throw at you? Still, medieval culture layered meaning on top of everything. A goat in your dream might symbolize sin or stubbornness, or just the fact that you'd been kicked by one earlier that week. The point is, Dreams were rarely dismissed as meaningless. They were part of the fabric of life. The long broken nights of winter made these experiences even more intense. Remember that first sleep and second sleep pattern? Well, that waking interval in the middle of the night was often when people thought about their dreams. They might share them with whoever was awake, whispering across the straw bed about strange visions or bad omens. Some prayed against the influence of nightmares. Others took them as signs, storing them away in memory. The quiet, smoky darkness gave dreams an almost physical presence, like they were floating in the air of the hut with you. And then there was the church, which of course had opinions on all this. Some churchmen warned against putting too much stock in dreams, reminding people that not every vision was holy. Augustine, for example, argued that while God could send messages in dreams, so could the devil, and you needed discernment to tell the difference. Others were more lenient, suggesting that dreams might simply be reflections of your soul. But either way, people couldn't quite let them go. The human mind craves meaning, and in a world where the boundary between the natural and supernatural felt paper-thin, dreams offered a nightly doorway into mystery. Let's not forget the role of folk traditions, too. Rural communities had their own ways of interpreting dreams. A dream about water might mean an incoming storm. A dream of fire could signal arguments. Seeing the dead in your dreams wasn't just a random glitch. It was often seen as the dead trying to communicate with you. And in small villages, word of someone's vivid dream might spread almost like gossip. Old Gertrude dreamed of wolves last night. Best keep the sheep close today. F. For medieval people then, the midnight mind was both fascinating and frightening. Dreams weren't just personal. They were communal. They tied into religion, medicine, folklore, and daily survival. And when you consider how restless and interrupted their sleep really was, it makes sense that the dream world felt so vivid. Night after night, in smoky huts and drafty chambers, people lived not just in their waking lives, but in the strange, shifting landscapes of their imaginations. So while we today might shrug off a bizarre dream about, say, riding a bicycle made of cheese, a medieval villager would probably have taken it quite seriously. They might have prayed about it, asked a priest, or avoided cheese for a while. For them, dreams were too strange and too persistent to be meaningless. They were part of the nightly battle with darkness, fear, and hope. When we picture a cozy medieval night, it's tempting to imagine something like the modern rustic fantasy. Thick wool blankets, a roaring fire, maybe even a fur or two tossed across the bed. But comfort, in the way we think of it, was rarely part of the story. Bedding in the Middle Ages was mostly about surviving the night, not feeling pampered while doing it. Let's start with the basics, the bed itself. For peasants, there often wasn't a bed in the strict sense. Instead, you had a pile of straw, hay, or dried rushes laid out on the floor. Sometimes this was spread directly on the ground, other times in a simple wooden frame to keep it slightly off the dirt. To keep the straw contained, people used coarse cloth sacks, basically giant medieval pillowcases stuffed with whatever plant material was handy. And just to clarify, these weren't the soft, sweet-smelling straw bales you see at harvest festivals today. They were scratchy, full of dust, and often home to bugs. Imagine going to sleep while something tiny crawls across your arm. That was just normal. Now onto blankets. For poor families, the main cover was wool. Wool was everywhere, spun, woven, and endlessly recycled. A good wool blanket could last years, even decades, being patched and re-dyed until it was more whole than fabric. These blankets were heavy, itchy, and often damp, because huts were notoriously bad at keeping out moisture. You'd crawl under it, feel its weight press down, and hope that between the blanket and your neighbor's body heat, you wouldn't freeze solid before morning. Richer households, of course, had better options. Feathers and down came into play, stuffed into mattresses and quilts. Nobles sometimes slept under furs, fox, bear, or wolf, both for warmth and as a display of status. Imagine walking into a chamber and seeing a bed covered in glossy animal pelts. Part insulation, part intimidation. But even then, luxury was relative. Feather mattresses grew lumpy. Quilts absorbed smoke and sweat. Furs picked up lice just as easily as wool. Medieval bedding was warm, yes, but it was rarely clean or comfortable in our sense of the word. Pillows were another divide. Many peasants didn't use them at all. A rolled-up cloak or a sack of grain had to do. The wealthy, on the other hand, loved pillows. The more the better. They piled them high, embroidered them, stuffed them with down, and treated them as symbols of refinement. But pillows were so tied to wealth that there were moments in history when laws tried to restrict who could own them, just to prevent social climbing through bedding. Because nothing said out of your station, like daring to rest your head on a goose feather cushion. And then there was the ever-present issue of cleanliness. Bedding was rarely washed. Wool was hard to clean, straw had to be replaced rather than laundered, and even sheets, if you had them, were only washed a few times a year. Most of the time people simply aired their bedding out in the sun, hoping that fresh air would do the trick. Spoiler, it didn't. Beds harbored lice, fleas, and worse. In fact, going to the bed bugs became a common expression in some places, because the bugs were such inevitable roommates. Still, people tried to make things more comfortable. Herbs were sometimes scattered into straw beds, lavender, rosemary, mint, to mask smells and maybe deter insects. In monasteries, beds were kept simple but at least regularly maintained. Nobles added canopies and curtains around their beds, partly to keep out drafts, partly to show off their wealth. A bed wasn't just a sleeping space. It was often the most valuable piece of furniture in the home, carefully passed down through generations. In wills and inheritance records, beds were itemized almost like family treasures. For ordinary villagers, though, comfort was minimal. Bedding was heavy, damp, scratchy, and alive in ways you didn't want to think too much about. But after a day of labor, most people probably dropped into it without much complaint. Sleep was less about drifting into bliss and more about collapsing into necessity. So when you picture medieval peasants wrapped up for a brutal winter night, don't imagine cozy bedtime luxury. Imagine smoky air, damp wool, a lumpy pile of straw, and the sound of someone else's snoring inches from your face. And yet somehow people manage to survive and even consider this routine normal. When we picture a cozy medieval night, it's tempting to imagine something like the modern rustic fantasy. Thick wool blankets, a roaring fire, maybe even a fur or two tossed across the bed. But comfort, in the way we think of it, was rarely part of the story. Bedding in the Middle Ages was mostly about surviving the night, not feeling pampered while doing it. Let's start with the basics, the bed itself. For peasants, there often wasn't a bed in the strict sense. Instead, you had a pile of straw, hay, or dried rushes laid out on the floor. Sometimes this was spread directly on the ground, other times in a simple wooden frame to keep it slightly off the dirt. To keep the straw contained, people used coarse cloth sacks, basically giant medieval pillowcases stuffed with whatever plant material was handy. And just to clarify, these weren't the soft, sweet-smelling straw bales you see at harvest festivals today. They were scratchy, full of dust, and often home to bugs. Imagine going to sleep while something tiny crawls across your arm. That was just normal. Now onto blankets. For poor families, the main cover was wool. Wool was everywhere, spun, woven, and endlessly recycled. A good wool blanket could last years, even decades, being patched and re-dyed until it was more whole than fabric. These blankets were heavy, itchy, and often damp, because huts were notoriously bad at keeping out moisture. You'd crawl under it, feel its weight press down, and hope that between the blanket and your neighbor's body heat, You wouldn't freeze solid before morning. Richer households, of course, had better options. Feathers and down came into play, stuffed into mattresses and quilts. Nobles sometimes slept under furs, fox, bear, or wolf, both for warmth and as a display of status. Imagine walking into a chamber and seeing a bed covered in glossy animal pelts. Part insulation, part intimidation. But even then, luxury was relative. Feather mattresses grew lumpy. Quilts absorbed smoke and sweat. Furs picked up lice just as easily as wool. Medieval bedding was warm, yes, but it was rarely clean or comfortable in our sense of the word. Pillows were another divide. Many peasants didn't use them at all. A rolled-up cloak or a sack of grain had to do. The wealthy, on the other hand, loved pillows. The more the better. They piled them high, embroidered them, stuffed them with down, and treated them as symbols of refinement. But pillows were so tied to wealth that there were moments in history when laws tried to restrict who could own them, just to prevent social climbing through bedding. Because nothing said out of your station, like daring to rest your head on a goose feather cushion. And then there was the ever-present issue of cleanliness. Bedding was rarely washed. Wool was hard to clean, straw had to be replaced rather than laundered, and even sheets, if you had them, were only washed a few times a year. Most of the time people simply aired their bedding out in the sun, hoping that fresh air would do the trick. Spoiler, it didn't. Beds harbored lice, fleas, and worse. In fact, going to the bed bugs became a common expression in some places, because the bugs were such inevitable roommates. Still, people tried to make things more comfortable. Herbs were sometimes scattered into straw beds, lavender, rosemary, mint, to mask smells and maybe deter insects. In monasteries, beds were kept simple but at least regularly maintained. Nobles added canopies and curtains around their beds, partly to keep out drafts, partly to show off their wealth. A bed wasn't just a sleeping space. It was often the most valuable piece of furniture in the home, carefully passed down through generations. In wills and inheritance records, beds were itemized almost like family treasures. For ordinary villagers, though, comfort was minimal. Bedding was heavy, damp, scratchy, and alive in ways you didn't want to think too much about. But after a day of labor, most people probably dropped into it without much complaint. Sleep was less about drifting into bliss and more about collapsing into necessity. So when you picture medieval peasants wrapped up for a brutal winter night, don't imagine cozy bedtime luxury. Imagine smoky air, damp wool, a lumpy pile of straw, and the sound of someone else's snoring inches from your face. And yet somehow people manage to survive and even consider this routine normal. When we picture a cozy medieval night, it's tempting to imagine something like the modern rustic fantasy: thick wool blankets, a roaring fire, maybe even a fur or two tossed across the bed. But comfort, in the way we think of it, was rarely part of the story. Bedding in the Middle Ages was mostly about surviving the night, not feeling pampered while doing it. Let's start with the basics. The bed itself. For peasants, there often wasn't a bed in the strict sense. Instead, you had a pile of straw, hay, or dried rushes laid out on the floor. Sometimes this was spread directly on the ground, other times in a simple wooden frame to keep it slightly off the dirt. To keep the straw contained, people used coarse cloth sacks, basically giant medieval pillowcases stuffed with whatever plant material was handy. And just to clarify, these weren't the soft, sweet-smelling straw bales you see at harvest festivals today. They were scratchy, full of dust, and often home to bugs. Imagine going to sleep while something tiny crawls across your arm. That was just normal. Now onto blankets. For poor families, the main cover was wool. Wool was everywhere, spun, woven, and endlessly recycled. A good wool blanket could last years, even decades, being patched and re-dyed until it was more whole than fabric. These blankets were heavy, itchy, and often damp, because huts were notoriously bad at keeping out moisture. You'd crawl under it, feel its weight press down, and hope that between the blanket and your neighbor's body heat, you wouldn't freeze solid before morning. Richer households, of course, had better options. Feathers and down came into play, stuffed into mattresses and quilts. Nobles sometimes slept under furs, fox, bear, or wolf, both for warmth and as a display of status. Imagine walking into a chamber and seeing a bed covered in glossy animal pelts. Part insulation, part intimidation. But even then, luxury was relative. Feather mattresses grew lumpy. Quilts absorbed smoke and sweat. Furs picked up lice just as easily as wool. Medieval bedding was warm, yes, but it was rarely clean or comfortable in our sense of the word. Pillows were another divide. Many peasants didn't use them at all. A rolled-up cloak or a sack of grain had to do. The wealthy, on the other hand, loved pillows. The more the better. They piled them high, embroidered them, stuffed them with down, and treated them as symbols of refinement. But pillows were so tied to wealth that there were moments in history when laws tried to restrict who could own them, just to prevent social climbing through bedding. Because nothing said out of your station, like daring to rest your head on a goose-feather cushion. And then there was the ever-present issue of cleanliness. Bedding was rarely washed. Wool was hard to clean. Straw had to be replaced rather than laundered. And even sheets, if you had them, were only washed a few times a year. Most of the time, people simply aired their bedding out in the sun, hoping that fresh air would do the trick. Spoiler, it didn't. Beds harbored lice, fleas, and worse. In fact, going to the bedbugs became a common expression in some places because the bugs were such inevitable roommates. Still, people tried to make things more comfortable. Herbs were sometimes scattered into straw beds, lavender, rosemary, mint, to mask smells and maybe deter insects. In monasteries, beds were kept simple, but at least regularly maintained. Nobles added canopies and curtains around their beds, partly to keep out drafts, partly to show off their wealth. A bed wasn't just a sleeping space, it was often the most valuable piece of furniture in the home, carefully passed down through generations. In wills and inheritance records, beds were itemized almost like family treasures. For ordinary villagers, though, comfort was minimal. Bedding was heavy, damp, scratchy, and alive in ways you didn't want to think too much about. But after a day of labor, most people probably dropped into it without much complaint. Sleep was less about drifting into bliss, and more about collapsing into necessity. So when you picture medieval peasants wrapped up for a brutal winter night, don't imagine cozy bedtime luxury. Imagine smoky air, damp wool, a lumpy pile of straw, and the sound of someone else's snoring inches from your face. And yet somehow people manage to survive and even consider this routine normal. When we think about medieval survival through winter nights, it's easy to picture sturdy peasants toughing it out, or monks dutifully praying between bouts of sleep. But the real test of the season was not for the strong and able, it was for the most vulnerable. Children, the elderly, and the chronically ill. These were the ones least equipped to endure the cold, the drafts and the smoky air of wooden huts. Their nights were more fragile, more uncertain, and in many ways more telling about how communities valued survival. Let's start with children. Babies and toddlers were notoriously hard to keep warm in a world without central heating or fleece-lined pajamas. Families swaddled infants tightly in layers of cloth, partly to stop them from flailing, partly to conserve precious body heat. Cradles were sometimes placed close to the hearth, though not too close, because the line between cozy warmth and accidental disaster was razor thin. Mothers or older siblings often brought the youngest children directly into the shared bed, tucking them between adults to use body heat as a medieval space heater. This worked, but it came with its own risks. Suffocation accidents, though rarely mentioned in records, must have happened often enough. Older children slept much like their parents, on straw pallets or in shared beds, but they often got the worst sleeping spots. If there were multiple siblings, the youngest or weakest might end up pressed against the wall, where drafts seeped through the wooden slats, or at the edge of the bed, where a blanket never quite reached. Winter illnesses like coughs, fevers, and the ever-present ague could sweep through entire families. The cramped, smoky, poorly ventilated sleeping arrangements made recovery slow and survival uncertain. Now the elderly. In a world where old age often meant 50, the aches and frailties of the body were amplified by cold nights. Arthritis stiffened joints, making it painful to crawl into or out of bed. Weaker circulation meant they felt the cold more deeply than their children and grandchildren. Families often placed elderly relatives closer to the fire, or piled extra blankets on them if they had them. In richer households, older family members might have smaller private chambers with their own hearths, but in most huts, it was about improvising. More straw, more wool, and the constant attention of family members. Interestingly, records and folk traditions suggest that the elderly were sometimes seen as more spiritually vulnerable at night too. Demons, nightmares, or night hags were believed to prey more easily on the weak. Protective charms, crosses, or herbs might be placed near the bed to safeguard an older sleeper. So their nights weren't just a physical challenge. They carried a sense of spiritual precariousness as well. And then there were the sick. Illness didn't take a break just because it was snowing outside. A sickbed in winter was a precarious place to be. Without much in the way of medicine, families relied on warmth, rest, and herbal remedies. Blankets were doubled up. Beds were sometimes moved closer to the fire or to a spot without drafts. The sick might share a bed with a healthy family member just to benefit from warmth, even if that meant passing on a contagious cough. Hospitals existed in towns, but for rural villages, care was almost entirely home-based. Nights were long, punctuated by coughing fits, whispered prayers, and family members keeping vigil. One thing to remember is that medieval families thought communally. No one expected the vulnerable to survive on their own. Keeping a baby alive through the winter or helping an elderly parent endure another year was a shared responsibility. Every family member contributed body heat, blankets, or labor. And when survival was communal, so was loss. If a child didn't make it through a brutal January, or an elderly grandparent slipped away in their sleep, it wasn't just personal grief. It was a reminder of how fragile the line between life and death was when your nights depended on straw, fire, and family warmth. So for the vulnerable, medieval winter sleep wasn't about rest. It was about endurance. Every night was a negotiation with the cold, a fight to make it to morning. Now let's wander into a part of medieval nights that was far less cozy and sometimes far less restful. The interruptions. Because even if you managed to fall asleep in your smoky, drafty little hut, bundled up with your family and a smoldering fire, the outside world still had its ways of barging in. Nights weren't silent. They weren't safe. And sleep was always something that could be interrupted by the unexpected. First, let's talk about watchmen, or more often, the lack of them. In medieval towns, some places had a designated night watch. These were men who patrolled the streets after dark, carrying lanterns, cudgels, or occasionally crossbows. Their job was to look for fires, thieves, or troublemakers. Sounds reassuring, right? Well, not really, because the watchmen themselves often made more noise than they prevented. They stomped around on cobblestones, banged their staffs, and sometimes shouted the hour like human alarm clocks. If you lived near a town square or gate, your peaceful night might be punctuated by the sound of someone bellowing, "Past 2 o'clock, and all's well," which was nice to know, but not exactly conducive to drifting back into dreams. Out in the countryside, it was even less predictable. Farms and villages didn't always have watchmen. Instead, families relied on dogs, neighbors, or simply light sleepers. Every creak in the wooden walls, every gust of wind rattling the shutters could be a warning, or could be nothing at all. But in an era when theft wasn't rare, people listened carefully. A thief might slip into a barn to steal livestock, or creep toward the hut to see if anything worth taking was inside. For this reason, doors were often barred at night with wooden beams or heavy stones, and people slept lightly, half ready to wake if a sound didn't fit the rhythm of the night. And then there was fire. The very thing that kept you alive in winter was also one of the biggest sources of danger. Sleeping with a hearth still smoldering meant that sparks could pop onto straw, or embers might roll onto a wooden floor. Whole houses or whole streets could go up in flames, so people kept one ear tuned to the crackle of the fire. Too quiet, and it meant the fire had died, leaving everyone to shiver. Too loud, and it meant trouble. Either way, sleep was shallow, interrupted, and never fully secure. But noise didn't just come from inside. Nights were filled with sounds that today we'd hardly notice. Wolves howling at the edge of a village, owls hooting in rafters, the creak of a cart axle as someone traveled late under moonlight. In towns there were cats fighting in alleyways, pigs squealing, or drunken neighbors stumbling home from the tavern. For many, these noises became the background hum of life, something you eventually learned to sleep through. But for others, especially in the vulnerable hours before dawn, they were unsettling reminders that the world outside didn't really rest, even if you wanted to. And then let's not forget the human element of interruption. Families crammed into one space meant that someone was always moving. A child coughed. An elder groaned. A baby cried for milk. Someone got up to stoke the fire. Someone else needed to relieve themselves outside in the cold, dragging the door open with a groan of wood. In a sense, medieval families were used to fractured sleep, not the 8 uninterrupted hours we romanticize today. Their rest was more communal, more practical, and more resilient to interruptions. So sleep in medieval huts wasn't just about enduring the cold. It was about enduring the noise, the danger, and the constant possibility that something, inside or outside, would break the silence. The rhythms of the year and seasonal sleep. When we talk about medieval winter nights, it's tempting to imagine them in isolation, as though life was always that cold, that smoky, that claustrophobic. But the truth is, medieval people understood their nights in relation to the whole year. Their sleep wasn't just about surviving a single night of frost. It was about moving through the long arc of seasons, each one changing the way people settled down, drifted off and woke again. In winter, nights were long, much longer than we're used to now. Imagine the sun setting in mid-afternoon and not rising again until late morning. That's a lot of darkness to fill. Artificial light was scarce and expensive, so people relied mostly on firelight, candle stubs or oil lamps if they could afford them, which meant that once the fire dimmed, sleep came earlier and lasted longer. But it wasn't a solid, uninterrupted stretch. People often slipped into what historians now call segmented sleep. They'd go to bed soon after dusk, sleep a few hours, wake for a while in the middle of the night, sometimes praying, sometimes whispering, sometimes just tending the fire, and then drift back into a second sleep until dawn. Winter nights stretched and folded, more fluid than our modern idea of 8 hours straight. By contrast, summer was a completely different rhythm. Long days, short nights, and fields that demanded every hour of labor meant that sleep became shorter, lighter, and more broken up. Farmers rose before dawn to work, napped at midday when the sun was at its hottest, and sometimes even slept outside to escape the stuffy heat of huts. Nights were less about huddling together and more about catching just enough rest to keep going. The rhythm of sleep bent itself around the rhythm of work, and the work was always dictated by the season. Spring and autumn were transitional times. In spring, sleep carried a sense of relief, even optimism. The worst of the cold was over, and huts that had felt like prisons began to loosen. Families slept a little more comfortably. Blankets were pulled off, fires didn't need to be stoked as often. People probably dreamed differently in spring, less about survival, more about planting, abundance, and the fragile hope that maybe this year would be a good one. Autumn, on the other hand, was preparatory. Nights grew colder again, families piled on straw and wool, and the weight of winter's long nights loomed just ahead. Sleep in autumn must have carried a certain heaviness, a quiet awareness that the easy nights were ending. It's also worth remembering that medieval people didn't think of time in the rigid way we do now. Hours were measured by church bells, the ringing of monastic clocks, or the slow burning of a candle. Seasons were a much more tangible measure of life than minutes. So when we talk about bedtime or morning, these weren't fixed concepts. They drifted with the sun, the harvest, and the turning of the year. Sleep itself was flexible, adjusting to what the land and the season demanded. In that way, medieval nights were less uniform, more seasonal, more organic than ours. Winter wasn't just cold, it was slow, heavy, long. Summer wasn't just warm, it was restless, busy, and brief. And all of this shaped not just how people slept, but how they thought about sleep itself. Not as a fixed block of time, but as a rhythm, pulsing and shifting with the cycle of the year. So when we imagine a family in a wooden hut, bundled under blankets with a smoky fire burning low, we have to imagine them not in isolation, but as part of a yearly dance with night and day. Sleep was survival, yes, but it was also a conversation with the seasons, a constant adjustment, a rhythm of light and dark that carried them through the year. Sleep, religion, and the spiritual night. When the sun went down in the medieval world, it wasn't just darkness that filled the hut, it was a sense of the spiritual. Night was never just the absence of daylight. For many it was the time when the soul was most exposed, when prayers were whispered, when the boundary between the human and the divine felt thinner. Sleep itself was tangled up with religion, shaped by the church bells, the holy calendar, and a quiet fear of what might drift into the room while everyone lay unconscious. Let's begin with the simple fact that most medieval Europeans lived in a deeply Christian framework. That meant night was punctuated not just by natural rhythms, but by religious ones. Monks, for instance, were expected to rise at specific hours of the night to chant prayers, matins or vigils, breaking their rest into fragments of devotion. While most villagers weren't bound by monastic rules, the idea trickled into everyday life. Waking in the middle of the night between first sleep and second sleep wasn't just practical. It was seen as a time for spiritual reflection. People used those quiet hours to pray, confess to God, or recite a psalm before drifting back into dreams. Dreams themselves were also viewed through a religious lens. Nightmares might not just be random. They could be temptations, messages, or even demonic visitations. The church taught that the devil prowled at night, preying on the weak, whispering in dreams, or smothering sleepers with fear. To ward this off, many families placed crosses above their beds, hung herbs thought to repel evil, or recited prayers before lying down. The simple act of making the sign of the cross before sleep wasn't superstition. It was protection. And then there was death. Sleep and death were often described as cousins in medieval thought. To fall asleep was to practice a little death, and to wake was a kind of resurrection. That made nighttime prayer especially important, because there was always the quiet possibility that you might not wake again. Fires went out, illnesses worsened, hearts gave way in the cold. Saying your prayers before sleep wasn't optional. It was insurance for the soul. Even the act of timekeeping at night was wrapped in religion. Church bells marked not just dawn, but the passing hours of darkness. A bell ringing at midnight might remind a village of prayers for the dead. or call the faithful to remember Christ's suffering. People didn't just sleep through the night. They lived in awareness that the hours were sacred, structured, and meaningful. But religion also provided comfort. Night was long, dark, and sometimes frightening. Yet the presence of icons, candles blessed on holy days, or relics kept in tiny boxes gave a sense of protection. Even in a smoky hut with creaking rafters, families felt they weren't entirely alone. Angels might guard the bed, saints might intercede, and if nothing else, the rhythm of prayer gave shape to the endless hours of night. So while we tend to think of medieval people as just shivering in the dark, they understood their nights as something layered. Sleep wasn't only rest, it was a spiritual exercise. Dreams weren't just random, they were part of a cosmic struggle. Night wasn't just danger, it was holy time, measured and blessed. The social side of night, neighbors, taverns and night owls. So far we've mostly stayed inside the hut, curled up with families by the hearth, listening to the fire crackle and the rafters groan. But not everyone was always asleep when darkness fell. Medieval nights also had a social side, one that tugged people out of bed or kept them awake long after the fire should have been banked. The hours after sunset could be quiet, yes, but they could also be lively, noisy, and sometimes downright inconvenient for anyone hoping for a solid stretch of rest. Let's start with neighbors. In tightly packed villages or town streets, walls were thin and sound traveled easily. If your neighbor's baby cried, you heard it. If someone argued by firelight, it floated through your rafters. In some ways, this constant background hum reinforced community. You were never completely alone, but it also meant your sleep depended partly on other people's lives. And not every neighbor went to bed early. Some stayed up spinning wool, mending tools, or whispering gossip. Their quiet chatter carried through the walls, mixing with the sounds of dogs barking and chickens rustling in coops. Sleep was always a shared experience, never entirely private. Now let's drift toward taverns. In towns especially, not everyone rushed home when darkness fell. Taverns and alehouses were social hubs where people lingered over drinks, argued politics, or sang until their voices cracked. For some, this was the only chance to relax after a long day. For others, it was a place to find trouble. Songs, laughter, and brawls spilled into the streets, carrying well past midnight. And while it might have been fun for those inside, for the people trying to sleep in huts nearby, it was just another obstacle between them and a quiet night. Imagine drifting off under your blanket, only to wake at the sound of a drunken chorus stumbling past your door. Night could be restless in more ways than one. There were also the night owls. Not everyone's life fit the same pattern. Some people deliberately used nighttime hours to finish work in peace. Millers, bakers, or brewers often labored through the night so that bread and beer would be ready at dawn. Shepherds sometimes kept watch over animals grazing late into summer evenings. Even craftsmen occasionally worked by lamplight to meet a deadline for a patron. For them, night was not a time of rest, but a chance to make progress without interruption. Their activity, of course, created more noise and light, two things that made sleep harder for those who preferred to rest in silence. And then there were gatherings that blurred the line between sacred and social. Festivals, saints' days, or even wakes for the dead often stretched deep into the night. Fires were lit, prayers were said, but laughter and drinking were rarely far behind. For villagers, these were moments of connection, occasions to bond, grieve, or celebrate. But they also meant that some nights were less about quiet rest and more about being swept into the rhythms of community life. All of this meant that medieval sleep was never fully under your control. You could pile straw, bank the fire, and close your shutters, but the sounds of your neighbors, your town, or your village still leaked into your hut. Sleep was as much a communal experience as it was a personal one. And sometimes the night belonged less to the sleeper than to the people who stayed awake. Sleep and class, peasants, nobles, and the very different ways of resting so far. We've mostly pictured the wooden huts of peasants, smoky, crowded, drafty, and noisy. But not everyone in the medieval world slept that way. Wealth changed the night dramatically. In fact, the contrast between peasant huts and noble chambers was almost like two different worlds sharing the same era. The way you slept said a lot about your class, your wealth, and even your status in society. Let's begin with peasants, since they were the majority. Their nights were defined by necessity: a straw mattress, a wool blanket if they were lucky, and the body heat of family members or livestock nearby. Privacy was non-existent, comfort was minimal, and survival was the priority. Peasants didn't expect luxury from sleep. They expected endurance, and they rarely got uninterrupted hours. The rhythm of work, the cry of children, and the draft of the hut shaped every night. Sleep was a communal resource, shared and patched together from what little was available. Now compare that to the nobility. Wealthy lords, ladies, and kings didn't just sleep. They staged their nights like performances. Beds were elevated, built on frames, and draped with heavy curtains to keep out drafts. Feathers, wool, or even down filled their mattresses, making them soft in a way peasants could only dream about. Rich blankets, sometimes trimmed with fur, added weight and warmth. Sleeping in a noble chamber was less about endurance and more about display. The bed itself often became a symbol of power, a piece of furniture so important it might be carried along when a noble traveled. And of course, privacy was another privilege of class. Nobles could afford separate chambers, or at least alcoves screened off with tapestries. Servants might still be present, stoking fires or waiting on their lords, but the sense of personal space was real. For peasants, sleep meant sharing a room with family, animals, and smoke. For nobles, it meant withdrawing behind curtains, separating yourself from the household, even if just symbolically. Interestingly, nobles also worried about different kinds of disturbances. A peasant feared the cold, the draught, or a thief at the door. A noble feared politics creeping into the chamber. Beds weren't just for sleep. They were where marriages were consummated, heirs conceived, alliances confirmed. Sleeping arrangements could carry public meaning. Who was allowed in the bedchamber and who wasn't mattered a great deal in aristocratic life. So while peasants huddled together for warmth, nobles layered themselves in symbolism. Yet for all the differences, there were similarities. Even in castles, fires had to be tended. Smoke lingered in rooms. Cold seeped through stone walls, and illness visited beds regardless of wealth. Nobles may have had velvet and fur, but they also had to endure drafty halls, sleepless nights, and the same basic truth. Winter made everyone vulnerable. The gap between hut and castle was wide, but not unbridgeable. Both worlds were governed by the same rhythms of night and season. So sleep in the medieval world wasn't just a private act, it was a mirror of class. The peasant hut and the noble chamber were like two ends of a spectrum, both seeking warmth and rest, but in very different ways. Childhood memories of the medieval night, if we try, for a moment, to step into the mind of a child growing up in a medieval hut. Winter nights take on a very different texture. For adults, nights were about responsibility, keeping the fire alive, worrying about thieves, praying for survival. But for children, nights were a mixture of fear, wonder, and memory. The kind of impressions that stay with you for life, the sort that shape how you remember your earliest years. Imagine being small, swaddled in rough cloth, listening to the low murmur of adult voices by the fire. You wouldn't understand everything being said, but the sound itself, the rhythm of familiar voices, would become part of what safety felt like. The crackle of logs, the occasional pop of sparks, and the steady breathing of siblings pressed against you. All of this was the background music of childhood nights. And when the hut creaked or the wind howled, you learned quickly that those sounds were simply part of the world. Fear was always close, though. Shadows loomed larger when your only light was a flickering flame. Stories told at bedtime often mixed faith and superstition, tales of saints and angels, but also of spirits, demons, and wandering souls. A child might fall asleep with both comfort and dread, clutching a charm or crossing themselves before drifting off. Nightmares were explained as something more than imagination. They were warnings, visitations, or glimpses of the unseen. A child grew up knowing that sleep was never just sleep. It was a journey. There were also the little pleasures of childhood nights. Winter meant being allowed to sleep longer, tucked in close without the constant demand of outdoor labor. Children might remember the feel of fresh straw being spread under them, or the warmth of being sandwiched between parents on the coldest nights. Some memories would be small and tender, the glow of embers casting strange shapes on the ceiling, or the rare treat of a candle burning longer than usual, making the hut feel festive. Over time, those childhood impressions became the fabric of memory. Adults might look back on them with mixed feelings, gratitude for having survived, nostalgia for the closeness of family, or lingering unease from nights filled with fear. In a way, childhood sleep in medieval huts was both harder and softer than adult sleep. Harder because children were more vulnerable to the cold, but softer because they were shielded by layers of care, warmth, and the cocoon of family presence. So, when we imagine medieval children, their winters were not just times of hardship, but also of bonding. The nights etched themselves deeply into memory, half comfort, half dread, all woven together in the dim glow of the hearth. The sounds of silence and the weight of darkness. When we close our eyes today, we often drift off to a background hum. Cars in the distance, the faint buzz of electricity, the glow of light sneaking through curtains. But in the medieval hut, night was a different kind of presence altogether. Darkness wasn't an absence. It was a force heavy and pressing, a cloak that covered the world in ways we can scarcely imagine. Once the fire burned low, the hut was swallowed in silence. Not the silence we know today, full of hidden machinery and faint mechanical rhythms, but a silence alive with its own textures. The crack of cooling wood, the shift of thatched roofs under wind, the muffled stir of animals outside or inside if they were brought in for warmth. Silence in those moments was not empty. It was a canvas painted with every small sound. That silence had weight. To a weary body it brought rest, the relief of sinking into straw, breathing in rhythm with family. But to a restless mind it could feel endless. Hours stretched out, the dark itself seeming thicker, the silence louder until the faintest noise, a branch scratching, a wolf howling far off, could surge with power and meaning. In that deep blackness, imagination had no boundaries. Faith helped, prayer whispered into the void. But fear was always close, lurking with the dark. And yet the medieval night also had its calm. The stars, when visible, were brighter than we can now comprehend, an ancient ceiling of lights without rival. A small ember's glow felt precious, a friend against the infinite dark. To those who grew up in huts, this silence and darkness were not unusual. They were the rhythm of existence. The weight of medieval night was both burden and balm. It frightened, it soothed, it stretched time itself. And so sleep was not just rest, but a surrender into something vast and unknowable, shaped by silence and shadow, winter dreams and the fires of hope. If the nights themselves were long, the dreams they carried were often longer still. In a medieval hut, sleep was never just a pause. It was a landscape of its own, filled with visions that could frighten, comfort, or inspire. Dreams were not treated lightly. They were not brushed off as random flickers of the mind. Instead, they were taken as messages, sometimes divine, sometimes sinister, but almost always meaningful. Imagine lying down in the thick of January, when the cold pressed against the hut and the wind moaned through the thatch. The body, wrapped in rough wool, sank into half-sleep. Fire still glowed, but faintly, and in that space between waking and dreaming, visions would come. A dream of fields green again, of spring returning. A dream of family gathered in health, food in abundance, and dangers pushed away. These were the fires of hope, the mind's answer to a world that seemed endlessly harsh. But not every dream was so kind. A nightmare could jolt the hut awake, seen as more than just the brain's restless invention. To dream of sickness might mean sickness was near. To dream of wolves or shadowy figures might suggest danger lurking outside. In the fragile quiet of the hut, these meanings carried weight. Parents soothed children with prayers. Adults muttered charms or traced the cross over their chests. Dreams were a space where heaven and hell both seemed closer than usual. Still, winter dreams also offered escape. For those who lived lives of labor and repetition, a vivid dream might be the most colorful experience of the season. Traveling in the mind when the body could go nowhere. Meeting faces long gone. Seeing visions of saints or even of Christ, radiant and untouchable. Waking from such a dream could feel like a blessing, a reminder that even the coldest nights were not entirely without light. The fire, when it burned low, gave its own dreamlike companionship. Flames danced, sparks hissed, shadows wavered on the walls. To fall asleep beside that glow was to let the fire carry you into other worlds. It became a kind of bridge, flickering between this life and whatever the mind could conjure. People often spoke of dreams as gifts, planted in the soul during those quiet hours. And in the long winters, such gifts mattered deeply, so dreams were not trivial. They were survival in a way. They offered hope when the world outside seemed only frozen. They reminded the sleeper that warmth, green fields, and brighter days would eventually return. Winter nights might be endless, but in the dreamscape, spring was always waiting, glowing softly just beyond the dark. Sleep as ritual, sleep as prayer. In the medieval hut, sleep was never just a physical need. It was a ritual, a daily surrender, and often a small act of faith. To us, bedtime might mean brushing teeth and checking a phone one last time. But to them it was closer to preparing for a journey, a crossing into the unknown night. Before lying down on straw or wool, people often prayed. Not grand cathedral prayers, but quiet murmured words. A simple sign of the cross, a verse remembered from church, a whispered plea. Protect us through the night, keep the fire from dying, keep evil spirits away. Night was always uncertain, and prayer softened its edges. The act of closing one's eyes was sometimes compared to a rehearsal for death. Sleep was a little death, and waking was a little resurrection. Priests wrote of this, and families believed it deeply. To wake in the morning meant God had granted another day. To fall asleep was to trust that the soul would return when morning came. That trust needed ritual, small anchors to make the darkness less threatening. Some families passed charms from hand to hand, bits of wood, tokens of saints, even herbs believed to guard against nightmares. Mothers traced blessings over children's foreheads. Fathers checked the hearth, its glow both warmth and holy protection. In places where folk tales ran strong, certain words were never spoken at night, lest they invite spirits inside. Silence was its own prayer. Even the position of the body carried meaning. Sleeping on one's back was discouraged in some traditions, thought to invite temptation or the weight of demons. Better to curl sideways as though folded in humility. Blankets, thin as they were, became more than coverings. They were shields, symbolic of God's care. And so every night was more than rest. It was a ritual cycle: prayer, surrender, trust. The hut itself seemed to breathe with it. The fire a vigil light, the darkness outside a cathedral of silence. Sleep was not just sleep. It was prayer embodied, repeated night after night through winters that felt endless, until spring returned once again.